Footprints appeared in the snow. They came from the edge of the forest, where the trees grew dense and dark, and moved slowly across the open field. Each step was clear, deliberate, unhurried. The footprints led straight to the farmhouse. Inside, 6 people had already been murdered, not in a struggle, not in panic, but one by one, quietly. When investigators later examined the scene, one detail stood out above all others. There were no footprints leaving the property. Whoever came to the farm did not run back into the forest. They did not flee down the road. They did not leave at all. And days later, long after the murders had taken place, the animals were still being fed, which means someone stayed, living alongside the dead. The place was called Hinterkaifeck, not a village, not even a proper settlement, just a single farm in southern Germany, in the Bavarian countryside, surrounded by fields and forest. In 1922, isolation like this was common. Farms were built far apart. Neighbors were distant. Silence was part of everyday life. If something went wrong, it did not always travel quickly. Sometimes it did not travel at all. Hinterkaifeck lay nearly a kilometer. From the nearest neighboring farm, there was one narrow path leading in, one way to arrive, one way to leave. On the surface, there was nothing remarkable about the place. It was a working farm, animals to feed, fields to tend, a routine shaped by daylight and weather. And yet, this ordinary place would become the site of one of Germany's most disturbing unsolved murder cases. Not because of how the victims died, but because of what happened after no one was left alive. Hinterkaifeck was home to the Gruber family. Andreas Gruber lived there with his wife, their adult daughter Victoria, and Victoria's 2 young children. It was a multi-generational household built around work and necessity. Everyone had a role. Everyone depended on the routine. Andreas was the head of the household, a strict man, known in the area as controlling and not particularly well-liked. But the farm functioned, and outwardly, life went on as expected. Victoria had returned to the farm years earlier, bringing her children with her. The farm was not just where they lived, it was where they were anchored. Only a few days before the murders, a new maid arrived at Hinterkaifeck. She had come to replace the previous maid, who had quit abruptly, claiming the farm was haunted. The new maid had been there less than a week. She barely knew the rhythms of the house, barely knew the people. From the outside, this was an ordinary rural family, private, isolated, largely invisible to the world beyond the fields, which meant that when something changed, there was no one close enough to notice right away. In the days and weeks before the murders, life at Hinterkaifeck did not collapse. It narrowed. The first sign appeared in the snow. Fresh footprints were found near the edge of the forest, where the trees stood close together and the ground rarely held light. The tracks crossed the open field and moved toward the farmhouse. They were clear enough to follow, measured, intentional. And then they stopped. There were no tracks leading back to the forest, no indication of where the person went next, no sign that they ever left the property. At the time, this was unsettling, but not alarming enough to stop daily life. Snow erased details quickly. Explanations were easy to accept when the alternative felt unreasonable. Not long after, a house key went missing. There was no forced entry, no broken lock, no visible struggle. Just the realization that one of the few barriers between the family and the outside world might no longer exist. Then came the sounds. At night, when the farm settled and the work was done, movement could be heard above the living quarters. Not voices, not shouting, just footsteps in the attic. Slow, patient. As if someone were walking back and forth, learning the shape of the space. Andreas Gruber searched the farm himself. He checked the attic, the outbuildings and the surrounding land. He found nothing that could be pointed to, nothing that demanded outside help. And so no report was made, no police were called, no neighbors were warned. Whatever was happening at Hinterkaifeck remained contained within the family. In hindsight, these moments read like warnings. At the time, they were treated as disturbances. Uncomfortable, but manageable. The routines continued, and whatever was watching waiting, or already present, was allowed to remain unseen. On the evening of March the 31st, 1922, the day at Hinterkaifeck ended the way it always did. Animals were fed, tools were put away, the light faded from the fields. There is no record of raised voices, no report of an argument, no moment that stands out as the beginning of violence. At some point after nightfall, someone entered the property. There were no signs of forced entry. Doors were not broken. Windows were not smashed. Whoever came to the farm moved as if they belonged there. One by one, members of the family were drawn into the barn. Not all at once, not in panic. Something was said, a task was suggested, a reason was given that felt ordinary enough to be followed. Inside the barn, the killings took place. The weapon was a mattock, a heavy farming tool kept on the property, familiar to anyone who worked the land. The blows were close, controlled, delivered without hesitation. There was no evidence of a struggle, no overturned equipment, no scattered tools, no signs that anyone ran. Each victim was killed in turn. When one body fell, the next person was still unaware of what had just happened. Afterward, the bodies were partially covered with hay, not hidden completely, just concealed enough to quiet the space. When the barn was silent, the killer entered the house. Upstairs, the children were asleep. They were killed in their beds. There was no indication that they understood what was happening. Finally, the maid. She was alone in her room, new to the household, unfamiliar with its dangers. By the time the night ended, 6 people were dead. The farm stood exactly as it had before. Lights out, doors closed, animals waiting for morning. Nothing in the yard suggested violence, and yet everything inside had been permanently altered. The murders were not discovered the next morning, or the morning after that. Days passed and no alarm was raised. No one came looking because, from the outside, nothing appeared wrong. The animals were fed. The cattle were calm. Smoke rose from the chimney, as it always had. To anyone passing at a distance, Hinterkaifeck looked occupied. Inside the house, the kitchen showed signs of use. Bread had been cut, food had been prepared, dishes had been handled. These were not the actions of someone panicking. They were careful, measured, repetitive. The routines of the farm continued without interruption. Whoever remained there knew when the animals needed feeding, knew where supplies were kept, knew how to move through the house without drawing attention. This person did not barricade themselves away from the bodies. They walked past them, worked around them, lived in the same spaces where 6 people now lay dead. The passage of time matters here. This was not a matter of hours. It was days, days of shared space, shared air, shared silence. Whatever fear might have existed did not prevent sleep, did not prevent routine. That detail changes the nature of the crime. It suggests the killer did not feel hunted, did not feel rushed, did not feel the need to disappear. The farm did not become abandoned after the murders. It became inhabited. And when the person who remained finally chose to leave, they did so unseen. No one noticed the moment Hinterkaifeck became empty again. The first concern did not come from fear, it came from absence. Days had passed and no one from the Gruber family had been seen. The children had not appeared at school, mail accumulated, small routines once reliable were suddenly broken. On April 4th, 1922, a small group of locals decided to walk to the farm, not because they expected violence, but because silence left too long becomes its own warning. They approached the property as neighbors would, calling out, expecting an answer. None came. The barn was entered first. Inside, they found 4 bodies lying on the floor, partially covered with hay. They had been there for days. The air was cold. The space was still. At first, there was confusion, then disbelief, and finally the slow realization that whatever had happened here was already beyond help. Only after the barn did they enter the house. Upstairs, the children were found in their beds. There was no sign they had tried to escape. In a separate room, the maid was discovered. She lay where she had slept, new to the household and completely alone. The authorities were notified, but by the time police arrived, The farm had already been entered by multiple people. Neighbors had walked through the barn, looked more closely than they should have, touched what they did not yet understand. In 1922, crime scene preservation was limited. Curiosity was human. Shock was overwhelming, and evidence once disturbed could not be restored. Investigators searched the property for signs of forced entry. They found none. They searched for witnesses. There were none. The murder weapon was not immediately located. Even when it was eventually identified, it offered little clarity. There were no fingerprints, no clear trail. From the very beginning, the investigation struggled, not because of incompetence, but because time had already erased too much. The answers, if they had ever been visible, were now blurred by footsteps that were never meant to be part of the crime. In the years that followed, investigators, journalists, and historians returned to Hinterkaifeck again and again, each time with the same hope that one overlooked detail might finally make sense of everything. It never did. One of the earliest ideas was that the murders were committed by a stranger, someone passing through the countryside, someone violent, someone who saw an opportunity. In isolation, at first the idea seems plausible. The farm was remote, the family lived largely unseen, but the details refused to cooperate. A stranger would have needed time to learn the layout of the property, to know where tools were kept, to move through the house and barn without alerting anyone. And a stranger would not have stayed. They would have fled at the first opportunity, left behind chaos, left behind fear. What happened at Hinterkaifeck required familiarity and patience. Another line of suspicion focused inward on Victoria Gruber. Her personal life had been the subject of rumor long before the murders. There were tensions, accusations, conflicts that never fully settled. In theory, motive could be constructed here. Jealousy, resentment, anger that had nowhere else to go. But motive alone is not enough. This theory does not explain why the children were killed, or why the killer remained on the farm afterward, continuing daily routines that had nothing to do with personal revenge. It also does not explain the calm. Crimes driven purely by emotion rarely leave behind order. The most persistent theory is also the least comforting, that the killer was someone who already belonged at Hinterkaifeck. Not necessarily a family member, but someone close enough to enter without resistance. Someone who knew the rhythms of the farm, when animals were fed, when lights went out, which spaces were used and which were avoided. This theory explains many things. The lack of forced entry, the choice of weapon, the ability to lure each person into the barn without raising alarm. Most importantly, it explains the days that followed. Only someone comfortable in that environment could have stayed, could have slept, cooked, moved through the house as if nothing had changed. And yet, this theory collapses at the same place as the others. There is no name, no witness, no proof strong enough to hold in court. Each explanation solves one part of the puzzle, none solve all of it. Hinterkaifeck resists closure because it exists in the spaces between familiarity and secrecy, between routine and violence, between what was seen and what was never noticed. The case does not lack ideas. It lacks certainty. The Hinterkaifeck murders were never solved. No arrest was made. No one was ever brought to trial. Over time, the farm itself became a problem, not because it held answers, but because it held questions that refused to fade. Locals avoided the property. Stories clung to it. Whispers replaced facts. Eventually, the farmhouse was torn down. The buildings were removed. The land was cleared. As if erasing the structure might erase what happened there, it didn't. Because Hinterkaifeck was never just about how 6 people were killed. It was about what happened when no one was left to see. The days that passed without alarm, the routines that continued without witnesses. The idea that violence did not announce itself, but settled quietly into daily life. Somewhere between the night of the murders and the day the bodies were found, someone lived on that farm. They cooked. They fed the animals. They slept under the same roof. And when they finally chose to leave, they did so without being noticed. That is what makes Hinterkaifeck endure. Not the brutality, not the mystery alone, but the possibility that the most disturbing crimes do not always feel like crimes while they are happening. Sometimes they feel almost ordinary, and sometimes they are only recognized once it is far too late to stop them. Some mysteries are remembered because they are shocking, others because they are unresolved. Hinterkaifeck is remembered because it suggests something harder to accept, that silence can hide almost anything. What do you think happened in Hinterkaifeck? Comment below. And remember to like and follow for more similar mysteries.